everybody, I'm Sarah Jones-Decker here at the Weizenblatt Gallery at Mars Hill University. We should be hanging out tonight at my gallery opening, but like all galleries, we are still closed to the public due to COVID-19. So I thought I would hang my show anyway and share it with you and the greater community virtually. So this is, my show is entitled Give Me Shelter, and it is images from my recent published book, The Appalachian Trail, Backcountry Shelters, Lean-Tos, and Huts. And it is a 2-year photographic documentary project on the history of every single shelter on the Appalachian Trail. So there's over 276 shelters on the AT, and contrary to popular belief, they are not all the same. So here is a shelter grid that I did of 25 images, and you can see it starts from Georgia, goes down to Maine. The basic structure is a 3-sided structure with one open side. It's always been that way. Some are enclosed in New Hampshire and Vermont due to the rougher winters, but the basic design is 3 walls with one open wall, a gently sloping roof to help with the rain and to keep you away from the elements. So I'm going to take the opportunity to tell you a few little stories about some of these shelters. You could fill an entire book with stories that have happened at these shelters, or tales about how they were built or who built them. You know, with 276 different shelters on the trail, it was hard to put a lot of information about every one, but there's some really interesting things. I wanted to talk about when they were built, how high the elevation is, how high they are off the trail. This is a great example of a shelter that probably, you know, if these walls could talk. This shelter was built in 1933 in New York, William Breen Shelter. And it's definitely a shelter where they gathered the materials in place. Again, this is the Over Mountain Shelter, one of the best views on the entire AT here in North Carolina. Currently closed. You're welcome to hike there and camp nearby, but they don't want you to stay the night inside. This is Roan Mountain Shelter, also a North Carolina shelter. It's the tallest shelter on the entire Appalachian Trail, over 6,000 feet, and it's considered the coldest place on the Appalachian Trail south of the Mason-Dixon line year-round. This is an example of the enclosed shelter in Vermont. This is an old fire warden's cabin. Roan Mountain is also a fire warden's cabin. This is Plum Orchard Gap Shelter in Georgia. That's one of the shelters that was brought in piece by piece via helicopter. This is Spring Mountain Shelter, which sits above Hot Springs on the Tennessee-North Carolina line. It's one of the original Conservation Corps shelters. It's actually on the AT, which is not as common anymore. You can see there's a blaze right on the shelter there. It says the AT is just literally right in front. And that is an original structure. It was milled in place, and it was also built around 1933. Deer Park Mountain, also above Hot Springs. Actually, we have 3 of the oldest shelters in a row are in North Carolina above Hot Springs down the road, which is pretty interesting. All the older Adirondack style log 3-walled shelter, lean-to. Blood Mountain Shelter is a great example of an old stone shelter. Some say it was built by the CCC, some say it wasn't. It's hard to track down the exact answer on that, but Partnership Shelter here in Virginia is one of the few shelters that you can order pizza at, so that is definitely a popular spot. Priest Mountain Shelter in Virginia, it actually sits just below the summit of Priest Mountain. Priest Mountain Shelter is famous for that everyone confesses their sins to the priest in the shelter journal there. This is a good example of an older shelter in Pennsylvania, Pine Knob Shelter, one of the earlier shelters that still exists with that real wide chinking. This is the last shelter in New Hampshire, Gentian Pond, and this is Rainbow Springs Shelter, which is one of the last shelters for thru hikers if they're getting ready to finish in Maine. So I think they have one more shelter after this before they summit Katahdin, so it's a very special place to a lot of people. The Appalachian Trail is actually located in Madison County, where Mars Hill University is located. This is a shelter, it's actually in Tennessee, but it's on the North Carolina-Tennessee border, Spring Mountain Shelter. So the Appalachian Trail is right here in our backyard. I photographed the AT for this project every month for 24 months straight. So you can see I have fall, winter, spring, summer, everything in between. I thru hiked the AT in 2008. So I hiked the entire trail from Georgia to Maine, at the time it was 2,176 miles, but who's counting? But yeah, it was really cool to be back out on the trail and to be able to hike with all my camera equipment for this go around. So shelters on the AT are built out of a variety of materials: log, wood, stone, cinder blocks, Back in the day, a lot of the shelters were built by the CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps. A lot of shelters were built in place. They would hike up, set up a temporary mill, cut down the logs, and build the shelter in place. Some shelters are brought in on the backs of volunteers. Some shelters are helicoptered in piece by piece, depending on their remote location. So just a different sampling of shelters here. This is Over Mountain Shelter, a famous shelter in North Carolina. It's actually an old barn. Currently it's closed because it's unsafe to hikers. It was never supposed to be a shelter. It is a barn that's been renovated to be a shelter. Some shelters have lofts. Some shelters have bunks. Some shelters have sleeping pads or wraparound bunks. Back in the day, the shelters were just dirt floor, so a basic dirt floor. Nowadays, almost all of them have some sort of wooden sleeping platform. This one is just plywood. You can see this one has a double system, so you can sleep up above there. This shelter is in the Smokies. It's a stone shelter with skylights and two platforms there. In the busy season of through hiker season, these will be sleeping bag to sleeping bag. People just lined up. Some shelters have views, some shelters are enclosed, and some of the older rock shelters have fireplaces inside of them. Thank you so much for coming today to visit the Weizenblatt Gallery with me. You can purchase my book at sarahjonesdecker.com, and of course you can find it at all the normal places like Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, Malaprops in Asheville. Thank you so much for coming today and spending your time with me.